In this comparative study, I will examine the Western genre's tropes and techniques in relation to Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, and how the cultural context of both films influenced their production of meaning over a similar story. Yojimbo, released in 1961, was directed by pre-eminent Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa and depicts a solitary, stoic hero seen in Toshiro Mifune's Sanjuro stumble upon a divided village riddled with gang rivalry and violence. A Fistful of Dollars, released only 3 years later in 1964 by Italian filmmaker Sergio Leone, weaves an intrinsically similar story of a lone gunslinger intervening in the violence of a small town, yet through the context of an American Western in what would spark the widespread Italian spaghetti Western movement. Through their experimental filmmaking, Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars enriched the conceptions of what the Western genre was defined as and created new styles and tropes that would be replicated forever, not just in Westerns, but throughout all of filmmaking. The first way that these films ultimately redefined their genre is through the use of the main character. Westerns preceding these two films often depicted a strong-willed, stoic protagonist, as seen in many John Wayne films, and to an extent, these films do embody that. Both start out with a sequence of their respective leads reaching the end of their ventures, with the camera work and musical accompaniment communicating their strength and stoicism. Leone and Kurosawa both coalesce their subjects with the grand scenery of the nature encompassing them, as seen in the first scene of Yojimbo, where the mountains communicate strength. In addition, they utilize low-angle shots to show the strength and stature of Sanjuro and the man with no name. One of the first notable contributions to the Western genre can be seen in this, as many Westerns largely incorporate nature and the setting of a scenario into the cinematography, which is largely derived from the influence of these two films. However, the leads to Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars introduce a concept seldom explored in films prior to this time: the anti-hero, and the moral ambiguity in the protagonist's actions. While stoicism and strength by a lead was nothing new in Western films, this was almost always accompanied by genuine heroism. In Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, Sanjuro and the man with no name do not provide concrete definitions of right and wrong in their actions, often manipulating people into positions that warrant opportunities for money and violence. They are motivated by their desires, not the desire to do good. Yet there are situations where they distinctly betray these selfish values and follow their moral compass. Not everything is black and white in the main character's actions. For a sizable portion of Yojimbo, Sanjuro chastises and taunts the foolishness of the opposing factions, while constantly betraying their trust. This moral ambiguity is something that was never typically seen in a Western protagonist before the 60s, and it is an aspect that has been emanated ever since, with Westerns such as Eastwood's Unforgiven, and even characters in other popular films such as Star Wars and Leon the Professional showing this. The camera work, blocking, and cinematography in these two films also revolutionized the tropes of the Western. With weaponry playing such a prominent role in the Western story, these films learned to encompass that into their framing. For one, the cowboy shot was developed, aptly named as it incorporates a cowboy's holster, or samurai scabbard, into the bottom of the frame. Though pioneered by John Ford, the shot is embraced in both Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, and has become a staple of both the Western genre and contemporary film since then. Both directors demonstrate a masterclass in incorporating environment and depth to create a more visually appealing shot. Both films layer people at different depths in the screen, which create meaning through the characters' positions. Take the scene in Yojimbo, where Sanjuro sits far in the background of the tower, yet is still the central figure in the frame, symbolizing his apathetic stance to either factions and his self-perception that he is superior to all of them. Incorporating background elements such as rain, wind, and tumbleweeds in the wides of film has become almost a cliche in the Western trope. However, these directors showcase how it serves to create a more interesting shot, as it adds a rich layer of texture and movement. These films develop the trope of the protagonist challenged and broken down by some opposing force or person. Yet, in their most susceptible and dire moment when they are broken down, physically or emotionally, they change to overcome their circumstance and defeat that opposing force. However, both directors use this structure as well as many other aspects of the Western to promote different meanings, as a result of their respective cultural backgrounds. In post-war Japan, the push for economic recovery after World War II's disastrous toll on the nation saw Japan abandon its traditionalistic regime and opened up to international, especially Western aid, as seen in the U.S.'s 7-year post-war occupation of the country. As bygone traditions and customs were diminished, both the public and pop culture began to open up and embrace aspects of Western culture. Kurosawa clearly stood in opposition to this hasty westernization of Japan when weaving his complex narrative in Yojimbo, specifically the more negative aspects of this reconstruction, such as the Yakuza. He is quoted as saying, "I was fed up with the Yakuza." He depicts capitalism in a very negative light, as seen in the foolhardy sake and silk merchants and their boneheaded compatriots. Additionally, Kurosawa creates an environment of comedy throughout the film, as seen in the constantly bowing mayor, and Toshiro Mifune's performance of Sanjuro, where he is often smiling, chastising, and making fun of the town and its inhabitants. This greatly contrasts with Leone's and Eastwood's more serious approach to both the character and the film. Yojimbo takes place at the end of the Tokugawa Shogunate era, where the role of samurai was rapidly decreasing and that aspect of traditional culture was diminishing, similar to post-war Japan. Sanjuro represents a ronin, one of the last true samurai, and Kurosawa's vessel to promote traditionalism, ultimately ridding the town of its westernization. However, he starts off as somewhat of a flawed samurai, constantly intermingling and manipulating the town, always carrying ulterior motives motives, and never truly sticking with the samurai code of honor. He shows the moral ambiguity of an antihero with his yearning for violence, as he says to the restaurant owner, which Mifune cleverly incorporates through actions such as the twitching of his shoulder, representing that he is always itching and ready for violence. He is challenged by the rival samurai, Unosuke, who serves as a clear representation of westernization, as his chief weapon is not a sword, rather the newfangled technology of an American pistol. Unosuke is sadistic, smiling and taking unnecessary joy in his weapon and his carnage. His cockiness and boisterousness serve as a representation of the betrayal of the traditional samurai, and thus the betrayal of tradition as a whole in post-war Japan. Unosuke is the catalyst for Sanjuro's suffering, vulnerability, and ultimate revenge, a commonly found trope in the Western genre. After his torture and narrow escape, Sanjuro is described as not looking like one of the living. This, combined with Sanjuro's literal journey through a coffin, somewhat suggests that he is reborn through his trials, and Unosuke's challenging of his role as a samurai. Unosuke causes Sanjuro to recognize his flaws and his own betrayal of the traditional role of the samurai, his jest, ulterior motives, and lack of commitment, all not strictly adhering to their traditional role. However, he ultimately returns to the town as a more hardened man and traditional samurai, defeating the quixotic Unosuke through the meager technique of a thrown knife, trumping Unosuke's advanced yet ultimately futile pistol. Sanjuro shows his return to a traditional samurai role by letting Unosuke die with honor with his weapon in hand, despite Unosuke's clear intentions to get one final shot off. His foolhardy death exemplifies Kurosawa's message into the film, and Sanjuro summarizes this by simply saying, "He died as recklessly as he lived." In Yojimbo, Kurosawa satirizes post-war westernized Japan through the use of warring factions and Sanjuro's presence in the film, and shows that rampant westernization can be a catalyst to return to tradition, just as Unosuke was for Sanjuro. Leone's interpretation of the Western genre and story set in Yojimbo is almost opposite to Kurosawa's intent, as Leone in his film endorses and is the literal embodiment of the westernization that Kurosawa is protesting against in Yojimbo. Sergio Leone, coming into the mid-1960s, was a relatively unknown yet visionary Italian director who wished to embody aspects from American films and make his films more palatable to American audiences. Leone had also been brought up in the old American Western and was genuinely inspired by them. The post-war period in Hollywood saw an influx in sword and sandal epics, which call back historical legends and myths, which Leone also tried to embody in his previous films such as The Colossus of Rhodes. However, these films began to decrease in popularity into the 1960s, which Leone certainly recognized. Instead, his push for American imitation was realized through one of his main inspirations, the American Western. Techniques such as the anti-hero and moral ambiguity, as well as the revenge aspect in the plot, appealed to Leone as he wanted to create his own twist on a Western genre already regarded as classic. Leone's quest to appeal to an American audience saw him use film locations across Italy and Spain, which mirrored the American frontier, as well as hiring distinctly American actors such as Clint Eastwood. Additionally, Leone and many of his crew anglicized their names in the credits to hide their foreign origin, such as Leone being credited as Bob Robertson. This failed to disillusion most audiences, however, and the Italian origin of Fistful and the subsequent influx of Italian-made westerns determined their moniker of spaghetti westerns. Because of Leone's desire to depict an American setting, many aspects differ between Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars. Yojimbo's close, cool, and damp atmosphere contrasts with Fistful's broad, hot, arid desert setting. This is reflected in the cinematography, where although they both share the use of iconic wides that make use of their backgrounds, characters in Fistful are generally much more spaced out. Leone often contrasts this with extreme close-ups which detail the subject's face in its entirety. This allows for the audience to see their true expression and emotion, doing this often as violence is being committed. Because of Sergio Leone's desire to depict the true, barbaric nature of the American frontier that is often explored in westerns, violence is contemplated upon and shown more explicitly in Fistful. Often the weapon of the perpetrator and its victims are shown in the same frame, allowing the audience to see the killer and the killed. In addition, violent set pieces and scenes are much more drawn out, and shots devoted to the victims and their deaths are much more frequent than in Yojimbo. In Yojimbo, because of Sanjuro's status as a samurai and Kurosawa's intent to depict him as a sort of a traditionalist savior, his killings are much less contemplative and take place in one fell swoop, demonstrating his mastery of the katana and samurai fighting style. As westerns are characterized by the acknowledgement of times past, both Leone and Kurosawa use this opportunity for setting to fulfill their respective intentions. Kurosawa refers back to a dying age in Japan to communicate the necessity of traditionalism in modern post-war Japan, while Leone uses the setting of a 19th century American frontier to cultivate greater appeal to American audiences. In this way, it can be seen that the separate contexts and cultures of Leone's and Kurosawa's films show that they have opposite intentions regarding the perception of westernization, despite the genre and story being nearly identical. Despite cultural and geographic context shaping Leone and Kurosawa's intentions differently, Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars both were integral in launching the spaghetti western movement and pioneering narrative and directorial techniques, which will be replicated in films of the western genre as well as mainstream cinema for many years to come.